It is now my pleasure to introduce Richard Russo, author of Chances Are and many other books. Richard Russo is the author of 8 novels. In 2002, he received the Pulitzer Prize for Empire Falls, which, like Nobody's Fool, was adapted to film in a multiple award-winning HBO miniseries. In 2016, he was given the Indie Champion Award by the American Booksellers Association, and he now lives in Portland, Maine. Infused with his signature humor and compassion, Chances Are is the story of 3 men, friends since college. Now in their 60s, Lincoln, a commercial real estate broker, Teddy, a small press publisher, and Mickey, a musician past his prime, get together in Martha's Vineyard to relive old times. As they reminisce, spill secrets, and affirm their friendship, they also probe a still mysterious incident from a Memorial Day over 40 years prior. As Ron Charles of the Washington Post calls it, a cascade of charm. One of the great pleasures of Chances Are stems from how gracefully Russo moves the story along 2 time frames, creating that uncanny sense of memories that feel simultaneously near and remote. Russo is an undeniably endearing writer, and chances are this story will draw you back to the most consequential moments in your own life. That said, please join me in warmly welcoming Richard Russo to Politics and Prose.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, all of you. God, look at you all. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Last night, can you hear? Yeah, okay, good. Last night, I was in New York at the Strand bookstore, and the person introducing me said that I was prolific. And that's the first time that word has ever been used. And I guess it's true. I always think of like Georges Simenon as prolific, but I was thinking at the time, going back as I turned 70 this year, and thinking back on the year that I was working on my first novel, Mohawk. Well, it was my first published novel. I tried to write another one before that. We won't talk about it, but I was remembering that when I finished the book and gave it to my agent in the hopes of selling it, I was at a point where it seemed that I've been writing for a while. I, like most then young writers, I find that almost all of them are likely to underestimate just how long it's going to take to publish that first novel. So I wasn't alone in that, but I felt very alone. And by the time I'd finished that first novel and given it to my agent, I had just about come to the conclusion that this was not going to happen. I loved the writing and I wanted to be a writer desperately, but it hadn't happened yet, and it seemed like it wasn't going to. And I remember thinking at the time that if the devil had showed up right then and offered me a deal saying, you can have this book, but then you're done, I would have taken that deal. And so all the others, including this one that I'm here to share with you tonight, would not have been written. So don't take those deals. That's my advice. That's my advice to all of you, and especially young writers. I'm going to read a little bit from the prologue. I'm not going to read an awful lot tonight. Give us time to chat, whatever's on your mind. I'll read a couple of short sections from the prologue. The prologue does what you would expect a prologue to do. It introduces the main characters. And in the first part, it kind of introduces them together and sets the novel in motion. And then after that, after a space break, it introduces each of these characters separately. So I'm going to do the first bit that introduces them together, and then I'm going to do one of these 3 musketeers, these 3 friends, and then we'll chat. The 3 old friends arrived on the island in reverse order, from farthest to nearest. Lincoln, a commercial real estate broker practically cross-country from Las Vegas. Teddy, a small press publisher from Syracuse. Mickey, a musician and sound engineer from nearby Cape Cod. All three were 66 years old and had all attended the same small liberal arts college in Connecticut, where they had slung hash at a campus sorority. The other hashers, mostly frat boys, claimed to be there by choice because so many of the thetas were hot. Whereas Lincoln, Teddy, and Mickey were scholarship students doing the job out of varying degrees of economic necessity. Lincoln, as good-looking as any of the frat boys, was immediately made a face man, which meant donning a scratchy white waist-length jacket to serve the girls in the sorority's large dining room. Teddy, who'd worked in a restaurant during his junior and senior years of high school, became a cook's helper, making salads, stirring sauces, plating entrees, and desserts. Mickey, they took one look and escorted him over to a sink where a mountain of dirty pots sat piled alongside a large cardboard box of off-brand steel scrubbers. Such was their freshman year. By the time they were seniors, Lincoln had been made head hasher and could offer both of his friends positions in the dining room. Teddy, who'd had enough of the kitchen, promptly accepted. But Mickey said that he doubted there was a serving jacket large enough to fit him. And anyway, he preferred remaining a kitchen slave to making nice with the fancy girls out front, because at least the galley was his own. Converging on the island 44 years later, all three were grateful for the educations that they received at Minerva. Where classes had been small, their professors available and attentive. To the naked eye, it looked like most other colleges did in the late 60s and early 70s. The boys had long hair and wore faded jeans and psychedelic T-shirts. In dorm rooms, the kids smoked dope and covered the smell with incense and listened to the Doors in Buffalo Springfield. But these were matters of style. To most of their classmates, the war seemed a long way off, something that was going on in Southeast Asia and Berkeley and on TV, but not in coastal Connecticut. Editorials in the Minerva Echo were forever lamenting the lack of any real activism. "Nothing's happening here," one said, riffing on the famous song lyrics. "Why that is ain't exactly clear." No place on campus was less rebellious than the Theta House. A few of the girls smoked weed and went braless, but otherwise the sorority was a protective bubble. And yet it was here, far more than in their classes, that the real world began to reveal itself conspicuously enough that even 19-year-olds like Lincoln and Teddy and Mickey could not ignore it. The cars parked out back of the Theta House were not only nicer than those in the regular student lots, but also those in the faculty's. Stranger still, at least two young men who didn't come from wealth, the owner of these vehicles in the Theta lot didn't feel particularly lucky to be at Minerva, or even to have parents who could afford its staggering tuition. Where they came from, Minerva was like a natural extension of the first 18 years of their lives. Indeed, for many, this had been their safety school, and they spent their freshman year getting over the disappointment of not getting into Wesleyan or Williams or one of the Ivies. Though they had known the statistics on the grades and SATs required to get into these elite institutions, they were used to having other factors count too, things that you could neither talk about nor quantify, but still caused doors to magically open. Anyway, Minerva was fine. At least they'd gotten into the Theta House, was how they looked at it. Otherwise, they might as well have gone to UConn. On December 1st, 1969, the evening of the nation's first draft lottery, Lincoln convinced the house mother to let the hashers serve dinner half an hour early so they could all crowd around a tiny black and white TV in the back room where they ate their meals. Given that their fates hung in the balance, the mood was strangely buoyant, at least in the beginning. Of the 8 hashers' birthdays, Mickey's came up first, ninth out of 366 possibilities, causing the other hashers to break into a chorus of "Oh, Canada," which might have gone over better if they had known more than the first two words of the song. Of the other friends, Lincoln came next at 189, better, but not safe enough and impossible to make plans around. As the lottery continued, a relentless drumbeat of birthdays, April 1st, September 23rd, September 21st, the mood in the room grew more somber. Earlier, while serving the girls' dinner, they had all been in the same boat, but now their birthdays made individuals of them, people with singular destinies. And one by one, they drifted away, back to their dorm rooms and apartments, where they would call their parents and girlfriends and discuss the fact that their lives had just changed. Some for the better, others for the worse. Their grades and SATs and popularity suddenly beside the point. By the time Teddy's birthday finally came up, he and Lincoln and Mickey were the only guys left in the hasher room. Passionately opposed to the war, Teddy had told his friends earlier in the day that he would go to Canada or to jail rather than get drafted. So to him, this lottery was meaningless. But of course, that wasn't really true. He didn't want to go to Canada. And he wasn't sure that when push came to shove, he would have the necessary courage of his convictions to actually go to jail in protest. Distracted by these thoughts, by the time only 20-odd unannounced birthdays remained, he was convinced that his had already been read out and had somehow missed it. Maybe when they were adjusting the TV's rabbit ears. But then, there it was, 322nd out of 366. He was beyond safe. Reaching to turn off the TV, he realized his hand was shaking. There were a dozen or so thetas that they counted among friends, but only J.C. Calloway, with whom all three were in love, was waiting outside the sorority's back entrance when they finally emerged into the frigid dark. Once Mickey told her, with that big, goofy grin and plastered on his face, that it looked like he was headed for Southeast Asia. She slid down off the hood of the car that she had been sitting on, buried her face in his chest, hugged him close, and said into his shirt, "Those fuckers." Lincoln and Teddy, both luckier on a night when that, and not smart or rich, was what you desperately wanted to be, managed nevertheless to feel intense jealousy when they saw the girl of their collective dreams in Mickey's arms. Never mind the uncomfortable truth that she was already engaged to another young man entirely. As if Mickey's good fortune in this brief moment somehow mattered more than the short straw that he had drawn just an hour earlier. Then, as his birthday was announced, both Lincoln and Mickey had the same sickening reaction. That 2 years ago, the people in charge here had taken one look at Mickey and assigned him the shittiest hasher duty in the Theta House. And when he reported for duty, he would again be sized up at a glance and sent straight to the front lines, a target no sniper could miss. Right this minute, though, with JC nestled in his arms, they could not believe his incredible good fortune. This is called youth. Okay, skipping ahead. Mickey Girardi was from a rough working-class neighborhood in West Haven, Connecticut, famous for bodybuilders, Harleys, and ethnic block parties. His parents were Irish and Italian. His old man a construction worker, his mother a secretary at an insurance agency. Both were deeply committed to assimilation. They flew the flag and not just on the 4th. A veteran of the Second World War, Mickey's father could have taken advantage of the GI Bill, but he knew a guy who could get him into the pipe fitters union, which he figured was even better. Mickey was the youngest of 8, the other 7 all girls, and he was spoiled rotten in so many respects. Clothes bought especially for him, his own room right from the start. Okay, it was the size of a closet, but so what? The family's house was large, as it needed to be, but modest. Only 3 blocks from the beach. Great in the summer when cool breezes came in off the water. When the wind changed direction, though, you felt like you were living under the nearby interstate. The traffic noise was so loud. Sunday dinners, you were home, and no excuses. Spaghetti with sausage and meatballs and pork shoulder braising in tomato sauce. Michael Sr.'s mother's recipe, handed down reluctantly to her Irish daughter-in-law, with 1 or 2 key ingredients left out for the sake of contrast. Family first, America second. Or maybe vice versa these days, with so many grubby long hairs always flashing their imbecilic peace signs. Everything else came a distant third. For Mickey, music came first. His first job was sweeping up the mall music store where he had seen a Fender Stratocaster in the window and fallen in love. After the guitar came an amp. In a band at age 13. By 16, sneaking into raunchy New Haven bars and sitting in with older guys whose girlfriends didn't wear bras and seemed to enjoy revealing this fact by bending over in front of Mickey, who would later joke with Lincoln and Teddy that he had a hard-on for all of 1965. I catch you doing drugs with those guys, his father warned. You're going to be the first kid in America ever beaten to death with a Fenton guitar. Fender, Mickey corrected him. Well, bring it here now then, smartass. We'll do it right here. Save time. About the last thing in the world that Mickey wanted was to go to college. In school, he had always hovered between mediocre and piss poor. In school, but all of his sisters had gone or were going, and college was what his mother wanted. Community college, live at home, that was the plan. Mr. Easy, his mother always called him, always the path of least resistance. And Mickey supposed she was right. He wasn't terribly ambitious, but he failed to see what was so wrong with staying in West Haven. With his sisters gone, there was plenty of room, except on Sundays and holidays. Unfortunately, even to go to the community college, you had to take the SAT. So one morning, Saturday morning, Mickey did. Not wanting to disappoint his mother by being the only kid ever rejected by a community college because of his SATs, he declined a gig the night before and actually got a good night's sleep. He figured it wouldn't kill him to try for once. Tuition was cheap, and if he did well enough to snag a few bucks to help with books and expenses, it had put him in good with the old man. When the results came back, his mother met his father at the door. Have a look at this, she said, pointing to her son's score, which was in the top 2%. The kid's brilliant. Since Mickey was the only kid in the room, his father looked around to make sure that there wasn't another hiding somewhere. Which kid? He said. This one. Your son. His father scratched his head. This one right here? Yes, our Michael. His father studied the SAT results, then his wife, then Mickey, then his wife again. Okay, he said finally, who's the father? I've always wondered. The next day, Michael Sr. was still trying to work it out. Take a walk with me, he said, grabbing Mickey's shoulder with a meaty paw. When they were down the block and out of earshot, he said, all right, come clean. I promise I won't be mad. Who'd you get to take that test for you? Mickey felt his left eye twitch. You know what, Pop? He began. Don't say it, his father warned. Fuck you, Mickey said, completing his thought. Senior stopped walking and threw up his hands. You said it. And then he cuffed his son in the back of the head hard enough to make Mickey's eyes water. Help me out here, he said, because I want to understand. You're telling me that this test is on the up and up? Mickey nodded. You're telling me you're smart. I'm not telling you anything, Mickey said. You're telling me that all this time you could have done good in school and made your mother proud? Mickey felt that seeing things in this light took some of the luster off of his near-perfect SAT. He shrugged. What were we thinking? His father said, more to himself than his son. We were doing so good with girls. Sorry, Mickey said. Okay, listen up, because this is what's going to happen. You're going to go to college, and you're going to do good. No discussion. Either you make your mother proud or you don't come home. Mickey started to object, only to discover that he wasn't sure that he really wanted to. He himself was still processing the remarkable SAT results and had begun to think beyond community college. At West Haven High, when word got around about his SATs, several of his former teachers stopped him in the hall. Hey, what have we been telling you? Was what they all wanted to know. So instead of objecting to his old man's command, he said, Can I major in music? His father looked up at the sky and then at him. Why do you always have to push your luck? He said. Can I major in music? Mickey said. Fine, Senior said. Major in fencing guitars for all I care. Mickey thought about correcting him, but his father did have a point. He was always pushing his luck. Okay, what's on your minds? What should we talk about? As there are microphones here, one over there and one here. So come on up. Hi.
Hi. When did you first start thinking about using the draft as an idea for a book, and how you worked with the development of how many characters you wanted and where those characters would come from?
Yeah. The question was, when did I start thinking about a novel that was centered around the draft? It's an interesting question because I had, in one sense, I hadn't thought about writing a book that begins this way until I began it. So the short answer is 3 years ago, or thereabouts, 3 or 4 years ago, depending on how long it took me to actually finish this book and get it published. In another sense, I think it was kind of predetermined back in 1969 when I was in just such a hasher room, although not on the East Coast. I was at the University of Arizona at the time. When I was in a room where that pretty much happened, where a bunch of young men, sensing in the way you do as a 19-year-old the seriousness of what was going to happen, but not being old enough, experienced enough, or wise enough to really sense the gravity of it. I mean, at that age, you think, oh, all right, well, we're kind of all in the same boat. We're all going to be here. Let's get some beer too, and which is what we did. And so we both kind of knew and yet kind of didn't understand until the lottery until those ping pong balls began to pop up, and the birthdays got recorded. How did I decide on how many young men? That's easy, because I wanted somebody with a low number that was going to be going, and I wanted somebody with a high number, and I wanted somebody right in the middle. I gave Teddy my own number, 322. And I gave Lincoln the number of a friend of mine who got number 9. And I decided on Teddy's was 189, I think, or something, because that was the last that was the last number drawn, or 188 possibly was the last number drawn that first year where guys were actually called up. So one person who knows he's going, one person who knows he isn't, and one person who can't plan on anything until it all shakes down. That kind of made story sense to me, to put them in as radically different situations as you could to drive the story forward. Hi.
Hi. I just read the Cape Cod book.
Yeah.
I can't remember the names of any books I read.
That's that old Cape Magic.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's a line in there which the main character says about the main character. He was cocky enough to think he was a catch and self-aware enough to know that he wasn't. Was that you or someone else?
I don't even remember that line.
It obviously made a big impact on me.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. All of these books, not only that old Cape Magic and this book, but all of these books, even the characters in them that terrify me, and I've written a few of those, they all reside in here somewhere. A writer's tools are, his experience of life, and a lot of that is just your own experience as a writer. And so, the first person you look at every day when you wake up in the mirror is yourself, and there you are. You can move, but there you are. And so, no doubt, that's a thought that had occurred to me at some point. But you hear people say interesting things in life, and sometimes you take that line of dialogue, and you think to yourself, "That's interesting. I got to use that at some point." But even looking at this book, I mean, the reviews have started to come in, and reviewers have pointed out just how different these characters are from one another. Lincoln, Mickey, and Teddy. And yet, in a way, what I did in order to come up with a cast of characters for this book was I kind of split my own character and personality into three kind of equal sections. Lincoln in this book is he kind of represents every time I ever had a chance in my younger life to take a risk and didn't take it because I knew there were other people depending on me. What all three of these characters have in common is that they're all living their lives and all going forward in their lives, making decisions, knowing that they have no safety net. Unlike the girls in the sorority dining room, and unlike the other students at Minerva College, these guys all know that if they screw up, there's nobody in their families that you can call and say, "Dad, Mom, I need 10 grand, or I need 1 grand. Never mind the 10." So they're all playing without a safety net, but they're temperamentally very different. Lincoln, because of that, has gotten in a habit now at age 66. He's pretty much in the habit of playing things safe because when he was a younger guy, he simply had to. So he's become politically conservative. He's the one Republican, lifelong Republican in the novel, but he's also very emotionally conservative. Family means a lot to him. He doesn't stray. He's just a very conventional guy, and he ends up, I guess, not surprisingly, in real estate. Teddy could not be more different, and even in this part, he's the one who's most passionately against the war, and at 66, he's even left of where he's now left of where he was back then. so he, like most of us, he has become more so, right? And he also, the other thing that he has in common with me is that he has a kind of contemplative, even religious or spiritual streak. He has a small press, but it's devoted to spiritual matters. I might as well. You probably suspect it anyway, right? I was an altar boy straight through pretty much high school. So I was able to offload some of that, onto one of these characters. And as I said, I just turned 70. Segueing to Mickey, I just turned 70. But when the right song comes on the radio, I begin to doubt what I've spent my life doing, telling stories, because with the right song on the radio, all I want to do is what Mickey wants to do, and that's strap on an electric guitar, plug it into a killer amp, and go to town. So so to return to that original question, where does this come from? Where do these lines come from? Where do these scenes come from? A lot of this stuff gets buried, and you find yourself, what novel is this of mine? I don't know, but new stuff continues to bubble up as you change from one story, one book to another. New stuff continues to bubble up. Some of it's what you've observed in life, but a lot of it is that just that looking at yourself in the mirror in the morning and thinking, really? Other questions? Sir, are you standing in front of the microphone because you meant to? Oh, yes. Hi. Yeah.
I haven't read this yet, but I just want to thank you briefly for Elsewhere, which your memoir, which I read, actually listened to you talk it through on a car trip. And I want to thank you because my wife was with me, so she was listening to it too. Yeah. And, Elsewhere is such a story of you and your mother. And for my wife, who had I'd say a difficult relationship with my mother. Mm-hmm. It was nice for her to be able to see that there was one mother out there who would have been far worse. And I think my wife felt a little better about her mother-in-law after hearing her.
I'm happy to help her.
But what I really want to ask you about, as I say, I haven't read this, but having read Elsewhere, and also having listened to you at the beginning of your talk tonight, talk about what a dicey, sort of fragile thing it was to become a writer. That's what it sounds like. Mm-hmm. How fragile was it, and what drove you, and why did you, were there times when you were giving up? I know you had a wife, couple of kids, and a very problematic mom, all that. Looking back on it now, what made you stick with it, and how close a call was it, would you say?
Well, it's pretty close. Where to begin? I think a lot of it, a lot of my desire to become a writer, there was the positive aspect of it, because a lot of my friends, I was in a large English department, and about the only people in the department who seemed to be having any fun were the people in creative writing. So I was jealous. That was part of it. They were the ones who, after their workshops and seminars, would find the nearest bar and talk about literature until late in the morning. We scholars were just the dullest bunch in the world. I mean, we weren't even reading literature anymore. We were reading books about literature. We were reading literary criticism I had just bottomed out. I didn't want to do it. And I took a class in creative writing, and this is and I'm like 6 years into a PhD. I'm writing my dissertation, and thinking to myself, all right, that's great. At the end of all this money invested and everything, I've found out what I want to do now, and it's just at the end of a very long road with a lot of expense, when I announced that, first to my wife and then to my mother, both were, as you would expect, utterly horrified, because I was thinking about actually not even finishing my dissertation, not completing my degree, and just saying I want to become a writer. And I think my wife Barbara was probably pregnant with our first child by then, and my mother, who often thought that I wasn't quite right, was convinced that I had turned that corner that she suspected I was going to turn into just flat out insanity. So it was kind of and we compromised that I would finish my PhD, and I did. And that was fine. But then there was a period of years, I'd already been trying to become a writer for a couple of years. And then there was another period of another 2 or 3 years where, like most writers, all you get in the mail is just rejections. You're putting manuscripts into boxes and envelopes, and putting stamps on those envelopes that cost money and money that could have been spent on something else. And when you're that close to the bone, spending $10 a week on postage just is taking money away from other things that you need. And so, yeah, it just felt at some point, just before Mohawk got accepted, it felt like a fool's errand, and just about everybody agreed, although I did get a few stories accepted, and my wife came around first. My mother didn't come around. I don't think my mother came around until I won the Pulitzer. She kind of had to admit then that it might work out. So it was, but I'm saying all this right now. It makes it sound worse than it is. I think that that's basically the road for almost every artist. It gets really shitty before it gets good. My younger daughter, Kate, is a painter, and has worked since she finished her MFA at the Slade School in London. She has worked so hard with. And done such really good work, but is not sold enough to even begin to live on, and so over a period of like a decade, how do you keep going? How do you keep doing that? And I've watched her with both elation, because I'm knowing how hard she's worked, so hard that she's wrecked her painting arm. She's had surgery on it a couple of times, and she's. I've watched her with such pride to see how seriously she has taken her work, and to know how little in the way of money. I mean, you need it to keep going, and how little of that has come her way as a result of it, and watched her with a sinking heart, as you do as a parent. The only reason I'm telling you this story is that it has a happy ending. She just sold her first novel. So she's still painting. She was the exact opposite of her father. She resisted the urge for as long as she possibly could. Finally knuckled under, and sold a novel. So anyway, yeah, it's not easy for any artist. I was just on Martha's Vineyard with a writer friend of mine that I'm sure all of you know, either from having read his books or well, you probably know, or you know his name. It's Amor Tolles, who wrote A Gentleman in Moscow, right? Now, Amor did it the smart way, right? He went out and made money. He had a career in finance. And when he finally had made enough money to decide, I'm going to be a writer, there it was. That's how you do it, but it's almost like, but almost nobody does it like that. So, anyway, thank you for your question. Hi.
I have a question. It's on the perfection of the written word. You spoke at the F. Scott Fitzgerald Conference last year, and one of the things I got from it is that you wrote this book 18 times. Now, since then, I'm in communication with my 9 grandchildren, and I keep telling them, Richard Russo wrote a book and had 18 editions. And when you write, you got to rewrite.
Yeah.
I just want you to talk a little bit about the perfection of the written word.
It's a little bit deceiving. Number one, I am a compulsive rewriter. The older I get, the more compulsive I am about it. And to go back to the memoir, which I was writing about my mother's life, much more than my own. That's really a story about obsession. And I began that book thinking that my mother and I had such a hard time because of how different we were. She was obsessive compulsive, and it really narrowed her life. Her life just got smaller and smaller until she was basically housebound. And I had watched that, unable to do anything about it throughout my childhood and adolescence and adult life. And she worked so hard at her life with so little to show for it. And it was this obsessive trait. It was these rituals, these obsessive traits that she had that were responsible for that. I, on the other hand, I realize, am every bit as obsessive as she ever was, and yet for me, it's turned into a tidy living because I just rewrite my sentences. You know, I am obsessive about it. I am convinced that they can be made better, and that's almost always the case. And so that's what I've done. I've turned, you know, the kind of obsession that can lead to terrible outcomes in me actually makes for better books, I think. And when my books go to my editor, to my publisher, they're pretty well polished because at least the beginning, this is the qualification, I think, is that I would never say that my books have 17 drafts, but I can guarantee you that the first 100 pages do, right? Because the beginning needs to be right before you can build an awful lot on it, you know. So the first third of the book gets revised a lot more than the second third. The second third gets revised more than the final third, because then you're on the home stretch. Then you know by then, hopefully you know what this book is about. You know how it's going to end by the time you're 300 pages into it, and you really can sprint for the end. And so the last draft, the last third of the book probably only has 3 or 4 drafts, whereas the beginning might have 20. Right. So it's not. That's where the perfection comes in, I think.
And one last thing that the audience would like to hear. At the F. Scott Fitzgerald Conference, they've had 22 writers. You, in the 22 years, was the best received because you were humble and you met the people. And in the evaluation, everyone said, we liked this conference because of the way you approached. So thank you.
Thank you. As to humility, I will only say that those who know me best would say I have a lot to be humble about. Yes.
I wanted to ask a little bit about process, about when you're structuring your novel. Do you know at the outset what the structure will be? Is it an organic thing that develops as you go along?
I think if you look at my early novels and then you look at my later ones, one of the things that you would notice is that structure is much more important in the later ones than in the early ones. As a younger writer, I was content to start the story, just kind of blow my way through it, find out how it ends, and then maybe after the first draft, then look at the thing and say, is there anything else? Is there anything about the shape of this that I can improve upon? But they still, because of the way I was going about it, they're pretty loose-limbed books. They don't have a lot of structure. And so if you read those early books, you get the sense of, they're almost picaresque. You follow a character like Sully or like Sam Hall. Any of those books could have been titled The Adventures of Sam Hall or The Adventures of Donald Sullivan, in much the same way that you would think about The Adventures of Don Quixote. And so they're very loose-limbed. They're very freewheeling as you might say. What happened that I'm much more conscious of structure now, and structure is I think one of the pleasures of this book, and has been one of the pleasures of my more recent books, is that I started writing screenplays. And while I always hear out there that writing, people who love literature say that writing screenplays can be the death of the novelist and all of that, and it has been. Although I'm not sure it's screenplays. I think it might have been alcohol. Just going to Hollywood. just going to Hollywood. It may not have had anything to do with screenwriting. But when you write screenplays, like 99% of screenplays are written in 3-act structure. The first, they're 100 to 120 pages long. The first 20 pages sets everything up, puts the conflict in motion, introduces us to our characters. And you can feel in a good movie when you move from the first act of the screenplay to the second act, because it's at that point where you thought you knew what the movie was about and you thought you knew what the stakes were. But in the second act, it becomes more complicated, and suddenly the stakes are a little bit higher than you thought they were. The second act is the longest. It's probably going to be 70 or 75 pages. And by the time you get to the end of it, you have that sense that you started playing nickel, dime, quarter, but suddenly there's $25,000 in the pot, and how in the hell did you get there? Act 3, you can sense the next thing that comes is that you've made that final turn. You can see the finish line, and it's a dead sprint from that point forward. For a screenwriter, you're going to be spinning your wheels a lot if you're not thinking right from the start about 3-point structure. Where does my first act end, and why, and how? What are the complications that are going to up the stakes in the second act? Where does it end, and what's the sprint? Exactly how far do we go, and all that? Well, that's just structure, right? Write a few screenplays, and what happens is when you come back to writing novels, you start thinking about structure much earlier, just because you're used to it. And so that's what's happened in the course of my writing career, and I think it's a good thing actually that I went back and read The Risk Pool a number of years ago because it looked like I might be writing the screenplay, and I was amazed at how loose it was, and I started thinking about things like I might have done to give it more structure, but it was what it was, and it was who I was when I wrote it, but the joys and the pleasures of structure have become more important to me as I've aged.
Thank you.
Hi. Yes. Hi.
Hi.
We got time for one or two more here.
Okay. Well, the previous two questions actually were what I was going to ask, but
you find yourself right in front of that microphone,
and I do, because I'm just going to go with what I really want to ask is that having worked in academia, I just have to say that Straight Man is one of my favorites. And I still remember standing in an airport not being able to laugh out loud, so I was physically shaking and worried that security was going to come over and ask me a question. But I just wanted to ask, were you ever in a staff meeting where the level of snark and vituperitude was so great that it led to physical violence?
Part of me wants to say they were all that way. No, nobody ever, at least in any English department that I was ever part of, no one ever snagged somebody else in the nostril with the curly cue of a binder. But you could tell everyone wanted to. Actually, that was a book. That was a book in which I made a lot of things that I had been witnessing in the academy when I was teaching. I made a lot of things that people said as metaphor or said jokingly, and I just made them happen physically. For instance, when I was a young assistant professor at Penn State Altoona, a branch campus of Penn State University, there was in fact a duck pond there. I was like my second or third year there, and I was friends with the dean who was responsible for hiring and firing. And Penn State was pretty much what I described in that book. It was an institution that played the same game every year with its most with its most vulnerable faculty. That is, those who were not on a tenure track. They were hired for a class or two every year, and they probably were teaching at other institutions too. So adjunct professors, the deep, dark, nasty secret of the academy. That makes it's those people, those abused people, that make full professors' cushy lives possible. So, but anyway, I was walking around this this duck pond, treading through guano with the dean who was going, and it's just a few days before classes are going to start. And the dean was saying, same thing again this year. The legislature will not pass the necessary money. They will eventually, but it has to go down. It's like Congress. It has to go down to the 11th hour for me to give me my money so that I can hire my adjunct professors, tell them they have a life. They won't starve this year, maybe next year, but you won't starve this year. We're going to take care of you. But he can't do that until the legislature comes up with the money and sends it to him. And he was just as frustrated he could possibly be. And we're walking along, and there are these angry ducks, because they get fed, and we didn't have anything to feed them. So they were honking at us as we walked around the duck pond, and Kel is saying, "Oh, I can't do this until I get the money, and I can't get the money until they're going to give it to me. What am I going to do? Threaten to kill a duck a day until they give me my money?" And that line, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the stuff that bubbles up when you need it, but that you weren't thinking about at the time. About a decade after that, I was teaching at, I had 2 jobs in between that, and I was particularly frustrated one day, and I remembered Kel saying, "What am I going to do? Kill a duck a day until I get my budget?" And I thought, okay, somebody's going to actually do it. And so that was the exercise of Straight Man was taking it. I look at this book now. I don't see anything absurd at all about this book. It just what seems to me strange is that it doesn't happen more often. Why doesn't it happen every day? Stuff like this. But that's how that's what was going on in that novel. And it might even be why that was, of all my books, that was the easiest one to write. It was just, it's a running gag. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
So I don't have to thank you for all the pleasure you've brought me, and I think most of the other people here with all of your books, or many of them that I've read. But I was wondering, a couple of years ago, I read Nobody's Fool, and then not too long thereafter, I saw the film. And so forgive me, I don't know if you were the screenwriter.
Robert Benton.
Right. I
wrote the screenplay. I did some script doctor work on that after they started shooting.
So I had my own view about I had some disappointment about the movie, having truly enjoyed the book and all of its richness. But I was wondering if you have any comments on what it's like to have created this world and these characters and then see it in somebody else's realization in a movie with a lot of limitations, different constraints.
Sure. Well, I've been among the the luckiest novelists in America in terms of the HBO miniseries of Empire Falls and Robert Benton's movie of Nobody's Fool. In part because there were 2 great directors in Benton and Fred Skepsey, but also because the cast brought to those movies wonderful originality. There's stuff in the books wasn't in the movie, and it's perfectly fine to miss in the movie what isn't there. But if you were to reread either of those books and then look at those performances, you would realize that those actors brought things to the movies that weren't in the books too. So it does kind of go both ways. And I remember in both of those seeing scenes that a scene that Paul Newman is in or Ed Harris is in, and seeing the actor do something, and I thought that wasn't in the book, and that I had not dreamed that. Here's an actor bringing something new. So that's wonderful. I think of other writers. There aren't that many other writers. Dennis Lehane has been really lucky in films, Mystic River, and several of his other novels. But no, I've been. You just have to surrender the book and know that the book is going to be just fine. When they make the movie, they haven't ruined the book. The book is still available. It's over there on the shelf. You can pick it up. You can go into your bedroom if that's where your bookshelf is. Pick it up. It's just like it was before the movie was made, and that's fine. And then if you're lucky and you're working with really, really talented people, as I have been lucky, both in my own work and screenplays that I've written for other movies that were based on other people's books. You just have to surrender. And it's, well, I let my voice fall. That's basically, you just have to be willing to surrender something that's in one medium for something that's in another. And it's, do you like movies? If you like books better, read books. I don't know. If you like them both, go to both. You've been a wonderful audience tonight. Thank you so much.
I was going to say, this is the last question. We're going to let her ask that last question.
Please, we got one more question here.
Yes. Have you had the same agent all of your writing career? And if so, how much does he play a role in choosing or shaping your content?
I have had the same agent right from the start. He is my trusted second reader, my wife being my first. He has saved one of my novels, Bridge of Sighs. I was about ready to toss because I had like 500 pages written and it wasn't going anywhere. And I gave it to my agent, something I almost never do until the book is, as I said, I think I've finally bitten off more than I can chew. I think this is just a bad idea. And he saved that book by telling me what he thought I should do. He explained what he thought the book should do, and I took about 45 minutes to explain to him why it wouldn't work. And by the end of it, I had convinced myself. By the end of it, I knew he was right. So he saved that particular book. In other books, we've seen eye to eye, and in some books, we haven't seen eye to eye. And then we're just kind of at loggerheads, and we get to the point where I can accommodate as many of his criticisms as I can, and then I say, all right, let's give it to an editor and see what he or she thinks. So yeah, I mean, it's not the same with every book. He always has advice. Sometimes it's a book save. Sometimes it's book savingly wonderful, and other times we simply agree not to agree.
Thank you so much for your wonderful book.
Thank you.